While industries such as farming and consumer beverages heavily rely on the use of water, the scarcity of this sought-out substance remains to be an issue that extends far and wide. Here with more on water accessibility is Gary White, CEO of water.org and Water Equity. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. So, a lot of people don't really realize a lot of these huge companies that have a reliance on water sources, for their products and services, but we don't always hear about the communities in the supply chain that actually lead to that growth. Talk about some of the issues that you're seeing in the business community and really connecting those dots between water scarcity and some of these big companies.
Sure. Good morning. Thanks for having me here today. I think what we see is when we look at the climate crisis, it really is a water crisis. And when we hear about climate refugees, really what we're seeing is water refugees because of the scarcity of water that's brought on by climate change. Usually we see that in the form of droughts, but it's also in the form of flooding and wiping out, water resources or contaminating them. And so when you see people competing for water at the same time as corporations are competing for water, especially in some of the low and middle income countries where we focus, there is this need to kind of come together to provide opportunities for corporates and for other water users in those water basins to look at sustainability and equitable access to water. And so we're working a lot with the Water Resilience Coalition right now, which is made up of about 35 companies and growing who are committed to making sure that they are good stewards of water resources and have committed to reaching 300 million people with access to water. And so we're helping them to kind of live this out around to meet their goals.
And as we look at some of the companies that you work with and partner with, Bank of America, IKEA, Stella Artois, Target, even in terms of really making sure that they're providing the communities in India and Bangladesh and other places with, obviously you have to have a healthy workforce in order to be able to do that. But in terms of the business argument, it does seem like water seems to go on the back burner, especially in light of COVID here. What is the business case here for some of these corporations who are saying, look, why should we be as concerned about this?
Yeah. Well, I think it's, lots of reasons. First of all, it's just the right thing to do. If you're operating in a water basin that has limited water resources, it makes sense to come together with everybody there to find an equitable way to look at this. But then you look beyond that in terms of we were talking earlier with David about ESG. I think that when we see corporations responding in these ways and collaborating on something so basic to human survival, ESG comes to the fore. And so it makes good business sense from that perspective as well. But at the end of the day, I think we all recognize that everyone on this planet should have equitable access to affordable water. And the more we can do to ensure that for future generations, we should. And the real disturbing part of this is the people that we're trying to help, people living on a few dollars a day, they had the least responsibility for the climate crisis, and yet they're the ones that are going to, feel it the first and feel it the hardest. And so there's a moral imperative with this, along with certainly a good business reason to do it.
So then what should regulators do in terms of when it comes to some of this corporate responsibility for those who really do use the bulk of the resources, but then perhaps aren't the ones who end up dealing with some of the after effects in some of these communities?
Well, I think, from a regulatory perspective, it's shaking out right now in terms of what's happening with ESG and making sure that, it's real and that the positive social impacts associated with our activities are real. And I think there's nothing more real than, helping people who might be spending hours each day or sometimes spending, huge amounts of their income, sometimes 25% of their income to purchase water from water vendors in slums around the world. And when we see, so many, inequitable ways of having to shoulder this water burden, it just becomes, makes a lot of sense for us to rally behind them and to bring in those users of water. Even agriculture, accounts for over 70% of water use around the world. And so we see that competition between agriculture, manufacturing, and others. But, there are ways to make it all work so that everyone can have what they need and the ability to earn that ESG along the way.
And especially when you think already of inflation on things like food prices, when you add water scarcity into the mix with agriculture, certainly paints a picture that a lot of companies should be prepared for. A big thank you there to Gary White, CEO of water.org and Water Equity.